This is our kind of fun little map that we've become famous or infamous for, if anyone wants a copy of this, please feel free to give me your contact information after. I'll be happy to send it to you. But it's really our way of showing the area in which or the realm in which we live. These are those 10 areas of marketplaces that we cover, and a number of the vendors and products that we evaluate within each of those streams, spread out on a subway map motif. And I don't want you to read too much into this and try to deduce too many conclusions off this. But what you need to know is that in any of these marketplaces, there's a variety of options to you as a buyer. Now, some of the hubs in the middle you might be able to see, and it's probably hard from where you're sitting, but some of the biggest names in the software world are really have a play in all of these different areas. So you have options from the biggest vendors in the world, but you also have a lot of best of breed options as well, and that's good for you as a buyer. This is a rich, fertile marketplace for you, and so you have choices. And I'll leave you with one other reason why we think we're a little bit different from an analyst firm, that's out there, and also provide some context for what you're going to hear from me today. I'm going to mention a lot of vendor names and products, but I want you to understand that we don't have any stake in the game when it comes to the vendors that we evaluate. We don't advise vendors on their product strategy. We don't speak at their conferences. We don't write white papers for them. To be quite honest, we don't take a cup of coffee from the vendors that we evaluate. And we think that provides us the necessary distance from the vendors that we cover so that we can give you, as buyers, the real story. Okay? So why are we here today? Well, I think I like to start, like most speakers, you'll see everyone start a presentation with some stats and some statements that kind of set the tone about the importance of video. I don't think I need to tell you in this audience, if you're at a streaming media conference, that live streaming of sporting events and events in general has become the norm. One of our biggest clients right now is actually dealing with record amounts of traffic to their live streaming of every one of the World Cup qualifiers that they're streaming on their website, and they're breaking that record every time they have another qualifier. This is all leading up to the World Cup that's coming up, and it's going to just smash some records, and it's really some exciting stuff. Video, according to Internet Retailer, those people who watch a video are 85% more likely to buy. Video ads are the fastest growing category of online advertising. And Cisco says that video is going to make up more than 66% of all the mobile data traffic by 2016. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. We all know this isn't very important. These are not earth-shattering things. But one of the trends that we've seen in the last year or so that we think is really different is that the idea of managing video within the enterprise is really becoming what we call part of the digital marketer's toolkit. If we go back a few years, the digital marketer's toolkit was primarily the email marketing tools, the marketing automation technology, the web content management tools. Maybe you did, as we've become more recent with social media publishing and social media monitoring. But for the longest time, video was always off somewhere else. The video people handled that. The digital marketers would talk to them sometimes, but they were really off on their own. What we're seeing more and more is video and the need for managing video becoming part of the main marketer's conversation. And one of the kind of, when you start thinking about that, the challenge is there that it's still very difficult to find a technology that gives you the capabilities that a marketer needs, from the creation of a video through to publishing it out to their necessary audience. One of the other things we're seeing is that enterprises are looking at technology that they already have to do this, and they're running up into some roadblocks. And that's after they spend a lot of time and money to try to shoehorn their existing technologies to get it to do what they think it should do, but they're hitting some roadblocks quite rapidly. We're going to talk about this in quite some detail, but we're seeing a wide range of technologies out there, or solutions out there, that really have some overlapping functionality and features that can create a lot of confusion out there for buyers, right? And there's a lot of different categories that you can find yourself spending a lot of time doing your research in, where you say, well, what's the difference between this and this? And when in actuality, there may be some similarities, but there are some real fundamental differences you need to be aware of. Online video platforms, there's a million of them, right? And I'm sure many of you are experimenting with them in your own enterprises, but we're seeing more and more pop up every day and get more and more traction in this marketplace. But so my point here is that there's a real vibrant marketplace, and that can be a good thing, but it can also lead to some challenging situations where you deal with certain vendors and products out there are much more mature than others, and that can create some opportunities as well as some challenges. So we were asked to come in and give this presentation as sort of a how-to, how to select the right technology, the right video management technology. And what you might ask, well, why do we need to do that? Well, I'd like to start by just saying we've seen 5 traditional ways of selecting technology that get some people in some trouble. And the first I like to call this blind love. And this happens a lot at conferences just like this one. You can go walk around that showroom floor, and you can see demo after demo after demo, and guess what? They all look great, right? They all say, what did they show you? You can leave here and say, wow, this is exactly what we need. This is exactly what I've been looking for. And you can go back to the office and you say, I saw my solution, let's buy it. It might seem crazy to you, but that happens all the time. And then the companies call us later and say, I think we picked the wrong product. Can you help us figure this out? That's number one. Number two is the scenario we like to call the happiness is a warm set of binders. And this is the scenario where you spend weeks and weeks developing your laundry list of requirements for your new technology, and then you send it out as an RFP. And what do you get back from a bunch of vendors? Something that looks like that, where you have to sift through and spend more weeks and weeks and weeks trying to figure out what they're trying to offer. It's not exactly the most productive way to pick a new technology. The third way that I see this going wrong is the my Cousin Vinnie way. And this can happen whether it's a colleague in your office or it's your next door neighbor who you're telling about, I need a new video management solution. He says, I did this in my old job. I got the guy just for you. Let me give you my contact at vendor X, Y, and Z. Number 4, I call the family car syndrome. And I don't know about all of you, but when I first got my driver's license, I was envisioning my first car being some nice red little sports car. But in actuality, this was very similar to my first car because that's what my family had. I like to say this is why organizations end up with SharePoint a lot of times, because you just have it. Or in the context of the video management space, when people in their marketing people go to their IT folks and say, we need a tool to deal with our video assets. Well, IT oftentimes comes to them and says, well, we already have a document management tool. Can't you just use that? Or we already have a web content management tool. Can't you just use that? It's not necessarily so that you can't use those for certain video asset scenarios, but you hit those limits really quickly because those systems really weren't designed for video with video in mind. And finally, there's the idea of the horse race. And if you've ever been to a horse race, I can imagine many of you are not professional handicappers, and when you go there, it's a good time, and you do a little bit of research, you get these little pieces of paper that give you the odds, and you say, I'm going to bet on this. Many people pick technology in a very similar way. They go to other analyst firms out there and they say, oh, look at this quadrant of technologies, and they look in the upper right and they say, oh, maybe I can only consider the upper right because those are the leading tools. Let's look at those and pick a technology. Well, oftentimes the best fit vendor for what you're trying to do is not in that upper right, and you're missing out on a key opportunity. So in all these ways not to pick technology, we think what we're really encouraging to do is take the guessing out of it, right? Don't let it come down to a guess. And the way we do that is we've developed a methodology over the last 12 years called RSVP. It's kind of a silly little name, but we call it the Real Story Vendor Procurement Process. And what it is really a set of 6 different phases that are designed to be empirical in that you're testing at every stage of the game. You're testing yourself, you're testing the vendors, and you're testing them for their they're fit for what you're trying to do. It's also meant to be a little agile so that you're able to do a number of different tests and corrections along the way. So, and it's designed to be a number of quick phases as opposed to long, drawn out phases. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So I know this is a little bit difficult to see, but really, our process for selecting technology the right way is broken down into a set of 20 very intimidating steps, right? And I know this is intimidating, and I don't mean to intimidate all of you, but I can honestly say that the most successful selection processes have done most of these steps. And you can swap out some steps in here, and some of these steps take a real short period of time, some of them a longer periods of time. But fundamentally, what I'd like to do today is just take you through the different steps and give you some best practices along the way. So the first one might seem obvious, but to do a proper needs analysis. And I say it might sound obvious, but we literally just got a call last week from a client and asking us to help them build the business case for the product they selected 2 years ago. All of a sudden, that project was off the rails a bit, and they said, "We think we picked the wrong product. Can you help us justify it?" Well, I don't know. We can try. But we can go back and help you think through the logic there. And building the business case is really important because you're and identifying the right stakeholders and establishing governance model and doing proper requirements gathering. And what I think the most useful part of that step is really being honest with yourself, right? Are we ready for this technology, right? So often people say, we have a problem, let's just go solve it. And people don't think through, what do we really need? What's our real problem that we're trying to address? And what's our readiness for this? And how much are we willing to take on to solve this problem? And the fact of the matter is that we see this day in and day out is that most enterprises overbuy. We use this example of, when you get a pile of mulch and you need to spread it around your yard, probably the best tool to get you there is a wheelbarrow, but many enterprises are doing the equivalent of buying the dump truck, right? They're drastically overbuying for what they need, and that comes with a lot of functionality, but in reality, they're using only just a portion of it, but paying through the nose for it. So do the business analysis up front. Be honest with yourself about what you can handle and what you can't handle. The next phase is probably the most critical phase in this process, and that is what we call developing testable scenarios. So what I don't want you to do is what I mentioned earlier with that binder example, is go out and spend a lot of time recording all of your requirements up front. I want you to take an honest look at yourself and think about a future state of what you want your new system to be able to deliver for you, and develop narrative scenarios that really paint a picture of what that future state might look like. Okay? Now, this is a little bit art and science to this, because the trick here is you want to be descriptive without being too prescriptive. Right? You want to describe your situation of what you want to be able to do, but you want to be open-ended enough so that the vendors can come in and give you their best solution to your challenge. Okay? So we say, don't form RFPs that look like this. Really spell out those narrative scenarios and use those as the bulk of your RFP. Yes, sir?
On those scenarios, what are they typically lengthwise? Are they pages, paragraph?
Great question. So when you write the scenarios, how long should they be? Typically, we recommend you do about 6 to 8 scenarios, and usually they're only about a couple paragraphs to a page long. Right? So they're not crazy, but you can build a lot into a scenario. When I say the scenario, you're describing the people or the types of people involved. You're describing the processes that the content would flow through. You're describing the environments that your people are working in. So if it's a mobile environment that they need to be interacting with content, or if you're in a video example, if you need to distribute content to all corners of the world, you need to really describe those unique challenges, but make it as real as possible for painting that picture of what you're trying to do. And that exercise is very enlightening for you internally, right? Because it gets your selection team and your internal folks all on the same page, and so everyone understands what it is we're trying to do. But vendors tell us they love this approach because it really does give them a much better sense of what they're getting into. So often vendors tell us they waste so much time when they get those laundry list of requirements. They're trying to go through that and figure out, does this even make sense for us? So it's a big time saver there. So those scenarios are going to be the bulk of your RFP, okay? They're also going to, once that RFP comes back and you're done with the RFP phase, you're going to keep using those scenarios as part of your demo phase, and we'll talk about that in a second, and then into the bake-off as well. So you're not just writing them and forgetting about them, you're using them actively throughout this whole process. And again, really what we're trying to assess here is fit, right? So if you start with scenarios, you want to make sure you have a good fit from a scenario perspective. You're always going to need to assess the technology, make sure you're bringing in technology that's a good fit for your organization, right? I can't tell you how many times organizations get handcuffed by bringing in technology that's just a mismatch for their organization, and they're left being beholden to a vendor or a third party to even do the simplest of changes. You want to make sure this is a good partner fit. You know, we're usually talking about things from the technology perspective, so this is a little bit different from a message that people expect us to be espousing. But if you don't like the vendor that you're working with, it's not going to be a good situation. And there's been so many situations where companies have ignored bad partner fits, even though they picked the best technical fit. It was deemed a drastic failure when push came to shove. And again, value fit is always important. You know, that overbuying scenario is very common. It's often that we can't ignore the notion of price, and we have to be honest with ourselves. What's this going to cost in the short term and the long term? So the next phase is market analysis, and we're going to dig in a little bit deep on this particular phase right now, because there's a lot of confusion when it comes to the market right now. And you know, the title of this session is selecting a video management platform, and that's a really broad term that can stretch into a number of different areas. Part of that confusion is because there's a lot of different technologies that offer some similar features. So we talked a little bit about one of the core components of many digital marketers' toolkits, and that's a web content management system. So many marketers are very used to using web content management systems to get content and images out there, and video for that matter. But it can only do so much when it comes to truly publishing video out there. Many digital marketers are very familiar with digital asset management systems. Many of these systems are fundamentally designed for image files and some video and audio files, but then as your video needs increase, some of the digital asset management systems just are not suited to expand with you. And then the media asset management systems that we'll talk about in a few moments. There's the notion of content delivery networks that many of you might be familiar with in working in tandem with a CMS or otherwise. There's the notion of online video platforms, and I'll give you some examples of those in a few moments. But for those organizations that are doing a lot of publishing of videos externally, they're seeing a lot of opportunities to utilize online video platforms. There's a whole slew of vendors that we'll call enterprise video platforms, so similar to the OVPs, but more with an internal focus, and I'll talk a little bit more like that. And then the video production stalwarts, if you will. So let's give you some examples. So here's some vendors that, as we've bucketed them, and as I mentioned, I'm an analyst, and we work for an analyst firm. We like to box things into categories and draw lines around things. So I mentioned it's not always clear, but this is kind of how we see some of these vendors playing out into different areas. So from a broadcast perspective, you have a number of vendors. You have some video production and distribution vendors that have some overlap, and actually you'll see some of the same names who we're trying to do a similar thing. And as I mentioned before, you have a whole slew of CDNs and OVPs that are really making a name for themselves, and new vendors, to be honest, are coming out every day and are making that marketplace quite a challenge to select the right tool. So let's dig in. This is our view of the media asset management world, and these are the vendors that we cover in our media asset management research report. And what we do in this report is divide them into two categories. So you'll hear a lot of these vendors all call themselves media asset management vendors, but really on the left side, what we have is what we call the broadcast media management vendors who really focus on that aspect of media asset management. And on the right, we have vendors that really focus on what we call the enterprise video management, production and distribution of videos. So if you're beginning to look at media asset management tools, you want to make sure that you start to align yourselves with what it is you're actually trying to do. Are you doing more broadcast externally, or are you doing more enterprise video management? And then if we take it a step deeper, what we've done in our research is we've realized that the various vendors that are out there have strengths in certain areas and not others. Now, some of their salespeople will say they have strengths in all of the areas. And what we encourage you to do is really begin to start thinking in a scenario context again and say, what is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to manage video for television news scenarios or sports broadcasting scenarios? Are we thinking about feature-length video, or is it more of a corporate audio and corporate video scenario? And this is how we do a lot of our ratings. This is the first step that when it comes to rating the vendors and their products out there, is we give them ratings based on their suitability to each of these individual scenarios. So when it comes to you going out and doing your research and coming up with a short list that you can do your due diligence on, this is where you want to start. Don't start by getting to the nitty-gritty. Start here and say which vendors are fundamentally designed with my particular use cases in mind. And then, once you get there, you can dig down into the weeds. And there's a whole slew of services that you should be thinking about, everything from the ingestion of video and the processing and how they handle the storage and organization in the back-end system, and then all the way through to assembly and delivery of video to the management and architecture services that you should be aware of. And so this is how, when we evaluate the tools, after you get to that short list, we recommend now you get to the real nitty-gritty and you do your evaluations on the things that are really most important to you. So if that's the media asset management, let's look a little bit more about the OVP and the EVPs of the world. And I mentioned there's a lot of overlap here. And some of the areas of overlap is, there's always this notion of creation of content, right? And there's ingestion, there's recording functionalities in some of these, and then there's a movement into a management phase. So there's what we call the more of a production management life cycle. And you have the ability to edit the videos. You have the ability to move videos through workflows. You can apply metadata and then retrieve content via search if you need to. And there's always a reporting layer and that kind of thing. And then finally, there's the actual delivery. So if you think about some of these tools, they all can do this. And when they tell you they can do these things, they're not lying. They can all do it to some degree, but their capabilities are certainly going to not be equal as you investigate each of these different services. Some will place a much higher emphasis on the delivery side, but a much less emphasis on the workflow and editing side. Right? And so you need to really be aware that you're not just looking at one aspect here. You're likely looking at the whole picture. So, like the MAM world, in like any of the technologies that we cover, we recommend that you start with scenarios. Right? So if you're trying to decide between an EVP and an OVP, we recommend that you, again, think about what scenarios you're trying to accomplish. If you're thinking about providing video for internal communication, or the classic example of doing an executive communication via town hall, or lectures and training, or web conferencing, or even live events within your enterprise. You're probably looking at the enterprise video platform. If you're looking at more of an external use case, like content marketing or branding and advertising needs, then you're certainly looking more at an OVP. If we dig into each of these areas a little bit, I can show you a little bit of how we see the marketplace. Now, I mentioned this is just a snapshot of the vendors. There's vendors coming out every day, and so we can't cover them all, but we cover some of the more significant vendors in the marketplace, we think. And when it comes to the EVPs, what we're seeing is really a bifurcation between the vendors that are offering both hardware and software together, as opposed to the vendors who are offering just software. And then if we look at the OVPs, we're looking at a whole slew of different vendors that are out there, and I'm sure many of you are experimenting with these tools as well. But one of the things that I'll caution you on is it's easy to get up and running with many of these tools. Many of them are offered as software as a service applications. You can just get started pretty quickly. But what we see clients struggling with is they get to a certain point where they want to integrate with other applications, right? They want to integrate with their web content management system. They want to integrate with their digital asset management system, or their MAM system, or their analytics tool. And they're really struggling with that almost universally. So if that's a key use case, that's something you're certainly going to want to test. So again, use case scenarios are key to figuring out where you want to focus your research at this phase. And I recommend that you align yourself with the ones that are most important with you, and then find the vendors that get the highest ratings in those different areas. And of course, there's always other considerations to take into consideration. There's many different installation options, if you will. There's on-premise software, there's hosted software, and there's a variety of hybrid options where you're using some of the services in the cloud and some as on-premise. There's a variety of licensing models to consider. Some vendors charge you by usage, some charge you as a monthly fee, some charge as a traditional seat license based on who's using the system from an internal perspective. It's a whole slew of different pricing models that you're really going to need to do your homework on, and make sure you compare apples to apples when you're comparing these technologies. So I talked about the RFP being a critical piece and making your scenarios the bulk of it, so I don't want to dwell on that too much in the time we have remaining. But in the next phase, I really do want to spend some time on the demos, because I can't tell you how many times that we see people go through these really time and resource intensive demonstrations where they have a vendors come in and demo their wares to a selection team, right? And that takes a long time. And usually we're talking about half day to a full day of demonstrations. And oftentimes we see it's a real waste of time for both the vendors and the people, the buyers in the room, because oftentimes they're not really structured. And what many buyers allow the vendors to do is come in and say, show us what you got. And again, it's like going into that vendor showroom in the room next door. Everything's always going to look good in that case. And oftentimes they come in and they show their latest and greatest features that are maybe some cool new technology that you might get around to using in 5 years. But the mistake that we see being made is that they're not demoing the stuff that's most important to you, the stuff that you're going to use every day, your employees are going to use every day as part of their work. So I can't stress enough that you really need to force the vendors to come in and demo your scenarios. You want to make sure each vendor that comes in demos the same scenarios so that you're comparing apples to apples to apples as much as possible. It's so easy to be swept up by the first thing you see or the last thing you see, but if you have a common structure for these demos, it's really much more useful much better use of your time. And the first bullet up here probably seems obvious to all of you. It seems obvious to me, but make sure your team is represented fully. One of the things that I hate is, but I've seen it happen over and over again, is where you form the selection team and you have vendor A come in and give a presentation. Then the next day vendor B comes in and it's a totally different group of people in the room. Or the director of marketing was in vendor A but not vendor B or vendor C or vendor D. And I've seen that just derail a selection process, and I really advise you not to go that route. And finally, actually, I kind of skipped. We kind of grouped these in a little bit different order. But before you select, one of the things that I really recommend our clients do is to hold a bake-off. And by bake-off, I mean a competitive proof of concept. So I mentioned that we've seen a lot of selections go bad, but some of the most successful selection projects that we've seen have taken the time and resources to do a competitive bake-off. And what I mean by that is you get down to your final 2 vendors that you have in mind and actually set up a very structured proof of concept for them to go through and mimic an actual implementation project as much as possible and do it side by side with 2 vendors. You will learn so much about the technology, about the user interface, the user experience, the team that you're going to be working with, and the company itself. It really is enlightening. And some of the best practices there is, again, use real scenarios. Right? You spelled out those scenarios at the beginning of this process. You don't have to have them build out all those scenarios as part of a proof of concept, but pick some representative scenarios and treat it as a proof of concept as well, and maybe test out some of the more challenging aspects of your project, some of the lingering questions that you say, I don't know if these vendors can actually execute on. Take advantage of that time and do that. And what we always recommend, use real content where appropriate. Use real people. Get your actual end users to actually get their hands on this technology, and if you can, do it in a real environment. So people ask, is that practical? I'm going to have someone come in and actually install their software on our servers as part of a proof of concept. Yes, if you can. If you have the resources to do that, that's an ideal situation. I know it's not practical in every situation, so it's not an absolute requirement, but when we're talking about many of these tools as software as a service options, you're able to get demos and sandbox environments where you're able to do some configuration and build out some very real proofs of concept that you can compare head to head, and it's really valuable. So I know it can be very resource intensive, but really, what's the cost of a failed implementation? So what I've tried to show today is a little bit different way of selecting technology. The traditional way is really develop your requirements up front, go through your RFP, proposals, and demos, then begin your project, and then do a big bang implementation. Right? For years, that's always been the way that we select and implement technology. And what we're suggesting is a little bit different way of doing that. Spend a little bit less time up front gathering requirements. You still need to gather requirements, but don't spend all the time in the world getting to the nth degree of requirements. But spend more time in the RFP proposals phase doing iterative testing, as I mentioned, and then spend significant time in that bake-off POC if you can, and then ultimately pilot and go into a phased implementation. So more value, more lessons that you're learning early in the process as opposed to learning these things way later in the process. So I'll leave you with some takeaways. There are obviously ways of grouping vendors. There's a lot of overlapping functionality, and one of the things, hopefully, one of the services that we provide to the community and other analysts as well is, we try to box things into categories to help you focus in on the technologies that's best for you. But don't just go and make the mistakes that so many other organizations have made in the past. Avoid the blind love scenarios, the My Cousin Vinnie, the thick binders, the family car, and the horse race betting. But really what you want to do is set up an increasingly intimate series of interactions with a vendor so that by the end of this process, you're sure that it's the right fit for you. And what you're doing is testing, testing, testing. I mentioned this is from some of the research that I showed you today is from our media asset management report. If anyone wants a free sample, you can go on our website, download a free sample of any of the research. I will also allow you if you want me to just send it to you directly, just come up, give me your card, and I'll be happy to do that, as well as give you our map and a copy of these slides if you're interested. So with that, I want to know if there's any questions. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So when you're talking about archiving, you're certainly not talking about the OVPs and the EVPs of the world. Those are more the delivery ones. But what you're probably talking about is a more traditional media asset management system.
Well, after it's been played, and after a year,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So typically people are using what we call the media asset management system, a traditional media asset management system. They're fundamentally designed for managing content throughout their life cycle, including an archive. So you're probably looking at more of a robust solution like a media asset management tool. Hi. It's a great question. So vendors generally like this process, with the exception of that competitive bake-off, right? Because that's a big time commitment from their perspective. So what we typically see in that case, or I'm going to back up. There's not a typical answer, but we've seen everything from vendors really volunteering or willing to risk their time and effort for a pretty substantial proof of concept phase with the chance of winning the business. That can happen, and I encourage you to, as a buyer, to push that first, and try to negotiate that. But there is negotiation that needs to happen there. Typically, probably the most common thing that I see is that you negotiate a kill fee for the losing vendor. So if you bring in those two vendors in, you negotiate a fee that says upfront that says, if we don't go with you, we'll pay you this certain amount. If we do pay with you, if you are the winner of the bake-off, then what you did here is not throwaway. It'll just roll into the project and be part of the winning thing. But it's very much a negotiation, and there's a lot of wiggle room there. But negotiate it up front before you start, and that's typically the best way to go. Hi. Sir. Yeah. So analytics.
like you choose the tool, and then down the road you find out how you integrate the existing analytical tools. So which of the tools from the 6 you demonstrated there is more aligned towards good outcome?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that the integration is always a challenge with any of these tools, and especially some of these more immature products that are cropping up, that are really good at getting video out there, but they haven't really matured to the point where they have a good story about integrating with a lot of existing enterprise tools like analytics tools, and so to that respect, I can't give you a good answer to say, oh, this one vendor can do it better than the other. Certain vendors are gonna, as they grow up, they're gonna get more experience integrating with an Omniture or Google Analytics, or so I'm sure they all have some story, but that's something you're really going to want to test. When it comes to those proof of concepts, one of the most common things that we see is testing integrations, because everyone's analytics package is a little bit different anyway. So that's something very customized that you're not going to know really works the way you want it to do until you actually do it. So that's something that you can absolutely include in part of the POC, and almost invariably are a huge part of that. Okay, so with that, I will say thank you for your time today. I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the show.